Last week, we began the radiant compassion process with compassionate awareness, the art of seeing yourself without judgment. And for many of us, that alone can be revolutionary because most of us were taught to evaluate ourselves long before we were ever taught how to understand ourselves. But once we begin to see clearly, a natural question starts to arise. Why am I like this? Why do I keep reacting this way? Why do I shut down here? Why do I over explain, over function, overthink? Why do I keep repeating the same patterns even when I know better? And often, the moment we ask those questions, judgment comes rushing back in. Today, I want to offer you something different. What if your patterns aren't random? What if they make sense? What if the ways you learn to protect yourself, to belong, to stay safe, or to stay connected were intelligent adaptations, not flaws or failures, but adaptations? Today, we're moving into step 2 of the radiant compassion process, compassionate understanding, making it make sense. Hey, it's Kelly G, your Radiance coach. Welcome to the Embodied Radiance podcast, episode number 6. One of the most important things I've learned in providing services through therapy, coaching, yoga, and in my own healing is this: patterns are rarely random. They're usually protective. The ways that we people please, perfect, prove, overwork, the ways that we stay quiet, try to manage other people's emotions, avoid conflict, or stay hyper independent. These aren't character defects. They're often strategies. Strategies our nervous system learned to help us survive, to help us belong, to avoid pain, to stay more connected, to feel safe. And if you grew up in environments where certain parts of you weren't fully welcomed, your system adapted. Of course it did. That's not weakness, it's wisdom. Over time, these strategies stop being choices. They become automated and they start feeling like who we are. And this is where identity forms. Maybe you became the responsible one or the easy one, the achiever, the caretaker, the peacekeeper, the strong one. And maybe these roles were rewarded. They may have kept things stable and helped you to feel safe, needed, or loved. But adaptation is not the same as essence. And many of us confuse who we had to become with who we truly are. And this is important because healing often asks us to know the difference. So much of what we believe about ourselves comes from the past. Who are you? How do you know who you are? How do you know what you're capable of? Most of us answer those questions by referencing what has already happened, what we've been through, what we've been told, what's been reinforced. But the past is not always the best predictor of possibility. And if we stay overly identified with our past adaptations, our future often stays very small. Compassionate understanding says this: of course I do this. And what happened that made this make sense? That inquiry changes everything. because it moves us out of shame and into understanding. It helps us stop fighting ourselves. It lets us hold our patterns with more honesty and more tenderness. Not to excuse harm or to avoid accountability, but to create the conditions for healing. Because you can't release what you can't see or what you don't understand. And you can't transform what you keep condemning. Here's something I want to offer that often gets skipped over in our rush toward change, and that's acceptance. Not approval, not resignation, not giving up or staying stuck. Acceptance is simply acknowledging what is true right now without arguing with it. This is who I learned to be. This is what I learned to believe. This is how I protected myself. This is what hurt. And for this moment, I can let that be true. So much of our suffering doesn't come from the pain itself. It comes from the shame that we feel about the pain, the judgment about the pattern, the exhausting fight with what is already happening inside of us. And acceptance softens that fight. Here's what I found. Understanding helps us make sense of ourselves, but acceptance helps us stop fighting reality. And when we stop fighting against ourselves, when we finally put down that sword, we create space for something entirely new to emerge. This is where the "and that's okay" practice from the last episode finds its deeper roots. Because in episode 5, we used it to soften self-judgment in the moment. And here we're taking it just a little bit further. When you find a pattern, a way that you adapted, an identity you grew into, a strategy your nervous system learned, try adding these 4 words. And that makes sense. I learned to people please, and that makes sense. I became the strong one who never asks for help, and that makes sense. I shrink when I feel criticized, and that makes sense. Not as a permanent story, not as an excuse, but as a moment of acceptance that allows you to see clearly without the noise of self-condemnation getting in the way. That's the bridge from understanding to acceptance, from acceptance to choice. So I want to offer you a reflection here. Take a moment and think of one pattern you've noticed in yourself lately. Just ask your mind. I'm sure it will have ideas. It may be overthinking or people-pleasing, withdrawing, proving, overworking, or shutting down. Once you think of that pattern, once you choose one, take a breath and ask yourself, what might this pattern have once helped me to do? Did it help me to stay safe, to stay loved, to stay connected? Just notice, no fixing, no changing, just understanding. And then whatever you find, add these 4 words, and that makes sense. I learned to go along and never speak up, and that makes sense. I became the one who held it all together, and that makes sense. I shut down when I feel overwhelmed, and that makes sense. Let yourself stay there for just a moment, because often underneath our patterns is a need that never fully got met. And meeting that with understanding instead of judgment, that's compassionate understanding. That's the bridge that can change the entire relationship you have with yourself. There's nothing wrong with you. You adapted, and that makes sense. Compassionate awareness helped us to see. Compassionate understanding helps us make sense of what we find. And acceptance helps us to stop fighting against it. When we stop fighting ourselves, we create the space for something new, something real, something that's actually ours. In the next episode, we move into step 3 of the radiant compassion process, which is compassionate release. It's all about what happens when we begin to let go of the roles and the stories and the protections that we no longer need. So until next time, I invite you to practice understanding yourself before trying to change anything, because your patterns make sense, and so do you. Until then, let your life shine.